Okay, good day, everyone. Or as I've gotten used to saying, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world. With so many of us either working from home or alone in the office, like I am. Welcome to today's live session. I'm very, very excited for this. It's kind of a culmination of stuff we've been talking about during Cybersecurity Awareness Month, but something that's been on the table, at least at QA Cafe for a while, to talk about how to secure the connected home. And in particular, securing home gateways and how the home gateway can act as sort of a hub of securing the entire home network. So like I said, my name is Jason Walls from QA Cafe, and I'm the Director of Technical Marketing there. And what I like to explain technical marketing as, rather than the traditional things that you would expect your marketing department to do, I'm kind of here to help really have good conversations about technological topics and put them in the context of the larger business world ecosystem. So that's where my expertise comes from, in addition to working very deeply on various standards for the home gateway and other parts of the home network. And I have with me here Dmitry Velikov from SECUR.
Thanks, Jason, for having me. Thanks a lot for the invite. And so my name is Dmitry Velikov. I'm a Director of Business Development for Americas for SECUR. And what I actually do day in, day out is work with our operator partners to come up kind of with the strategies on how to protect the connected home, the CPEs, and mainly the users behind and devices behind those CPEs and routers, gateways, and so forth. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Thanks again, Jason, for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's get started. Go ahead and grab control. I know you have some stuff to go through first. So the order of events here, we're going to talk a little bit about the situation with the home network and how vulnerable it has been, and how you can design more secure gateways. And then we'll talk about a little bit about the applications that can help secure the connected home.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Jason. So let me start with the kind of a bit of a preface of what we as F-Secure, what do we see as a kind of three main issues with the connected home devices. And this is not just us saying this. This is an old research actually from GARTNER, and things haven't really changed since 2018. A lot of companies have started to realize the importance of security. Unfortunately, usually through some sort of a big leak or big vulnerability that has ended up in the news and things like that. But the three key pillars for this is first of all, the lack of security standards. So this is such a new area, the whole IoT sphere, and creating kind of these connected home networks is rather new thing. And the bodies that create the standards are starting to establish, but security is still kind of a bit lagging behind. Another thing is that the security implementation itself is typically a little bit of an afterthought. So, if you think about these new startups that are trying to create new ideas for the gadgets, they don't typically think too much about the security in the first place. Like they have the design, the marketing, the sales, how the product looks like, feels like, and all those things, which are very important, obviously, because you don't need security if you don't have a good product. But the security still has to be there at some point, and unfortunately, it's many times forgotten. And then the last thing is that if you think about the life cycle of today's IoT devices, obviously, if you have like a laptop, phone, and so forth, you change them rather often, like you change them every 3, 4 years, 5 years, maybe. But then if you think about the IoT devices, you have a smart fridge. Like how often are you going to swap that out? Like 10 years, maybe 15, hopefully 20. But that's kind of one of the issues that you need to be prepared to support that device for a very long time, and come up with the ways to kind of fix the things for them after you have sold the device. So if you look at the variety of these kind of vulnerabilities that we see, they stretch anywhere from, everybody probably knows by this point, like Mirai botnet, which is basically taking over the IoT device and trying to use it for various malicious purposes. There's tons of different varieties today, from Bitcoin mining to information stealing and so forth. And then other kind of exploits that are targeting directly, sometimes CPEs, sometimes the IoT devices behind them. If you just open news on any given day, there's tons of news about hacked IoT devices or vulnerabilities within the cameras and TVs and so forth. And we see this in our own kind of a global attack traffic. So what we do at F-Secure, we have these honeypots all over the internet basically, and they are looking for or trying to kind of get different kind of attacks to themselves, so we can study them and understand what they're doing, and then what kind of exploits they're trying to use, what kind of vulnerabilities they're trying to access, and so forth. And we see this is from last year. You can see in 2019, like there was a huge spike of the amount of kind of these IoT attacks basically tripled. And if you look specifically on what these attacks are trying to access, the key areas are Telnet and SSH. So those are kind of the typical access ports for your typical IoT device, for your CPE, for any internet connected device for that matter that requires some sort of a management remotely. They typically have Telnet access or SSH. And that's exactly what the IoT kind of a botnets are trying to utilize. They're trying to attack these with usually with just list of default passwords that they're trying into these ports and try to get in and install themselves and replicate themselves further. So as one of these examples, just kind of show you a little bit of what they're doing. There's this HEH botnet that is rather recent. This I think launched only this month. And what it does, it's looking for, in the same way as many others, is looking for the port 23 and trying to get in using different passwords that have been exposed online, and trying to basically do a brute force attack on the using the password lists. And if it succeeds, it installs itself into the device, installs the botnet so it can communicate with other peers within the network, within the botnet network, and then it wipes out everything else. Like it has a way to basically brick the device. So you might have a router, you might have a fridge that suddenly has no firmware. So what do? What does the fridge do when it has no firmware? And probably starts leaking the first thing. So it's just an interesting approach. This is not a very sophisticated attack. We've seen way more sophisticated ones, but I think it's more of a proof of concept almost for something bigger, that it can replicate, brick the device and go to the next one basically. And these are just kind of attacks that we are seeing. If we look kind of from a different perspective, so those things that are kind of attacking the devices is one thing, but then there's also always kind of this user aspect that, no matter where the customer is, whether they're using the internet on their mobile phone on a mobile network, or they are within the home network using their PlayStation to serve the web, they are kind of always threatened by this user-initiated threats. So they are initiating those threats usually themselves, or like they end up in the situation like that they are compromised by users' own actions. And there's three different kind of threats like that. So usually the one is compromised websites, so which is trying to get user by some sort of a drive-by download into that site so that they can steal information, for example, or collect information just in general, credit cards, email addresses, and so forth. Second one is phishing URLs. So this is typically distributed through spam emails or various messengers and so forth, which we haven't seen this slowing down. This is an old trend. It hasn't changed really in the past 20 years. But when the customer is within the home network, they're basically facing the same threat. So we will talk a little bit later about how can we protect against that as well. And the last one is the web threats that are kind of trying to lure in the customer into some sort of a situation where they get information out of you, either through approaching you, for example, through a messenger, maybe some sort of a SMS messages I use sometimes for this, some sort of a social engineering attack, basically directly towards a specific person or a group of people. I see we have some questions coming in already. I will take those in just a minute. I will just finish this part. And if you look at the most common kind of a distribution mechanism, it's still unfortunately spam. So we look at how malware is distributed in general, how it's trying to attack the users. Basically, it's distributed through email in the form of spam, and then all the other kind of distribution methods are following. And it's unfortunately still using the same old technologies that you are basically kind of lured in to click on some sort of a link in the email, which is urgent, which is triggering you to do the action. If it's well targeted, sometimes even related to something you might already have. Somebody might know you have a DHL account, so they will use DHL as an email, for example, that sends you this kind of a notification saying that, hey, click here to see your invoice, or click here to track your shipment. We couldn't deliver it, to be able to deliver it, you have to click here. And then that leads into some sort of either compromised website or, asking your credentials for DHL or whatever that could be. The actual kind of most common threats that we see targeting end users directly is a phishing attack after the fact. So spam is basically the delivery mechanism for a phishing attacks. And those, again, are kind of the ones that are collecting all the information about you, basically, usually trying to steal your credentials, trying to reuse your credentials in other services after they have them, or try to collect, for example, credit card information or something else. Credit card information, not so popular because obviously, by clicking the link, you're not going to be giving your credit card right away on the first web page, but that happens as well. And now, especially during the COVID-19, there's just some examples of, or kind of a graph of statistics that we have on specifically COVID-19 related spam emails that are going after customers with the phishing attacks. You can see a definite increase during February-March timeframe in the emails that have some sort of a COVID team in the emails. And usually it's something like, hey, we've seen that your neighbor or your friend or something has a COVID-19 infection. Find out here if you're part of the risk group, or if you are the one infected as well. So it's kind of easy, especially because these attacks are usually driven by fear, and what more can cause more fear than COVID-19 situation that's in this day. Another thing that we're tracking is kind of what kind of brands are targeted by these phishing attacks. And this is, I believe, US-centric information specifically for this market from January to April in 2020. And you can see that it's very much financially motivated. The top attack vectors is Chase, Bank of America, PayPal, Wells Fargo, and other banks, basically. And the interesting thing in this, you can see the huge spike in the end. And if you look at the dates, it actually aligns very well when the stimulus checks came out. So that's an interesting note there. I think they hit the mailboxes in about 14th of or 15th of April, something like that. So right after that, we saw a bit of a spike in the phishing emails. Going after customer information and going after those stimulus checks. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we see on F-Secure side when it comes to CPEs being targeted, IoT devices being targeted, but also the users themselves, which is the ones that we are actually trying to protect in the end through these different devices. Back to you, Jason.
Okay. Yeah, so we do have a couple questions just coming in, but it looks like we can probably wait to the end for those. I do have one question for you, though. So you covered a lot of the vulnerabilities of the home network. What about the stuff that's not not Wi-Fi and not IP, like Bluetooth and Zigbee? Do we still have to worry about that stuff too, or?
Well, I would say yes. We did have to worry about it, and we definitely take those kind of into account when we design the products and when we try to protect the customers. But at the same time, we don't see that many threats using those, because they are kind of a short radio distance kind of a technologies that you have to actually be very close to the target to be able to attack them. So it's a bit hard to distribute malware necessarily over the Bluetooth unless you're hitting like a stadium full of people with it, which will kind of distribute itself. And we've seen those attacks already, like in early 2005, 2006 in Symbian times. There was an attack on a stadium where the Bluetooth virus went from one device to another, basically. But not too much with Z-Wave, Bluetooth, and so forth at this moment.
Okay, so obviously we have attackers targeting the home network more, but why is that the case? We covered a little bit, Dimitri covered a little bit about it. Obviously the pandemic situation is making people use the home network more than ever, but it was already that way. The level, the degree to which people are using their home network for basic services and IoT devices, et cetera, has increased exponentially, and it's going to increase exponentially. If you look at any report like that, the reliance on the home network is increasing more than ever. And because of that, users are dealing with sensitive data more, right? So either, especially now, if they're working from home, you're now bringing your corporate information into your home network. But as long as people are doing banking online, doing telehealth, and all of these sort of things, they're passing sensitive data around, which makes the home network a very, very juicy target for attackers. There's also more powerful and more vulnerable resources in addition to personal computing devices and mobile devices, IoT, the IoT devices, and the home gateway itself. They've all gotten more powerful, and we'll talk about why they're so vulnerable in a minute. But there's resources to be able to exploit there. And what attackers are really trying to do, right, is they want to do one of three things. They either want to exploit the computing resources that you have, they want to capture sensitive data, or they want to go so far as installing ransomware and that sort of thing. They'll use those resources for either DDoS attacks, or running botnets, or even doing cryptocurrency mining without you even knowing. And so the processing power of our home computing devices has increased exponentially, and so it makes it a prime target. The home gateway itself is a prime target specifically for these reasons, not only because they've become more powerful, but they are the most accessible thing in the home because they are the hub of the network. And they have been in the past sort of designed, with security as an afterthought, and a vast majority of the attacks that you've seen over the last few years were not due to some zero-day flaw. It was because they just had bad passwords or very weak security. And then there's also this lack of monitoring and ownership. So the gateway in particular, right? Or even in IoT devices, we're in a kind of a strange situation because you have the retail world on one side, you have the consumer, and then you have broadband service providers, and no one really knows at this point who it is that should be taking control over all of this. And then on top of that, the home gate IoT devices and networking devices in particular are not things that people watch all the time. If there's something wrong, or if there's some malicious code being run on something like that, you're not necessarily going to notice it as soon as you would if it was running on your own machine, right? If you're actively running it on a computing device that you're using to do stuff, you're going to notice it more often. You're going to notice it more than if it's running on some other devices. So all these things collectively make the connected home a very prime target for hackers. Again, the home gateway in particular is a big threat, but it also is a big opportunity. If we sort of treat it as the thing that we can control, then then that gives us a modicum of control over security of the home network and for the subscriber, right? So the gateway is the focal point of the home network. It's where all of anything that's going out in and out of the local network is going through that gateway. We have control over it, especially if you're a provider and you're deploying your own devices. There are good design practices that we can do to make sure that we harden the gateway. And we can also use it as a hub for monitoring and protection of the connected home. So when we talk about securing the home gateway, we have someone at QA Cafe who is very fond of saying that security is like, it takes effort, like it takes conscious thought to work it into your processes. And so it requires, good design, but it's bigger than that, right? It's an entire process that you have to build around from start to finish around what you're doing with your home gateway and your home devices. And we break this down into basically 4 really important best practices to do. The first is to understand your device ecosystem, how it's built, and what software is running on it. Require and or implement best practices, and I'll go into a couple of those in a minute. Obviously, make sure that regular testing is part of your process, both before and after and during regression. And then really keep the conversation open with your vendors or your partners up and down the supply chain, and make sure that this process and this communication is happening the whole time. So let's talk about that first one. When we talk about the device ecosystem, what we're talking about is understanding the underlying code base of it and the types of things that are running on it, and know what interfaces are exposed. So that includes, what distribution is it based on? There are a number of open source solutions out there, right? Or it might be based on the solution developed by the system on a chip vendor, right? But we're talking OpenWRT or Purple WRT or RDK and those kinds of things. Understanding what distribution is running on your devices, and what how often those things are patched and how old are they. We see a lot of devices out there that are running very, very old Linux kernels, right? So, even though they're running an open source platform, it just hasn't been patched in a while. And the thing to understand about open source projects, not just from the distribution level, but also things like OpenSSL and other open source programs that are running for networking purposes or whatever. Very often when there's a security flaw, the patch is just going to that open source project. And there's no information that goes out necessarily to they don't know who's using it, right? So if a patch goes out, it's only going to that open source project. So you have to be able to make sure that you are aware of all the stuff that's running on your device, so that you can be aware when something is going wrong, so that you can be aware when you need to patch it. And that comes into deciding how often those things are maintained, and how old are they, and how often are they actually patched? Are they a good piece of software? Are they a good open source project that has people actively working on it? So keeping that in mind, and then also understanding the interfaces that are running on your device and the defaults that happen to be spinning up based on the software that's running, right? So what are the basic services and applications that are running, right? Is it running Telnet by default? Is it running UPnP by default, right? What are those things that are always being spun up? Do you want those things? Do you not want those things? What ports are open on default? By default on the LAN and the WAN. Dimitri talked about the attack vectors there. You saw some very, very common protocols that maybe they don't belong on the home gateway, but they're still used as attack vectors. And then also, the one of the biggest flaws in home gateways is the GUI, right? So controlling how the configuration is accessed, making sure that it's only accessed one particular way. How do you access the device? How is it configured? And being aware of how open that process is. One thing I also bring up is something like, are there things that you don't necessarily want to be able to be configured by the end user that are easily exposed? We see, like the TR69 secret page is on a lot of devices. So that jumps right into requiring best practices. And I've talked about a few of those just now, but like I said, so most of the attacks that we've seen in the past, like Mirai, they're not, well, actually Mirai's the opposite thing, but most of them other than Mirai are not 0-day attacks, right? They are vulnerabilities in very common things. They're either because default passwords were too common, or they were out there, or you know, there's you know, some other mechanism of accessing the device that that is just well known that was never patched. So that falls into, like I said, securing the GUI, securing the execution environment, making sure that the applications that are running with the principle of least privilege, right? So, you know, you don't want basic services running as root. And one thing that we do run into a lot is, you know, people who are in the process of development, and those Q&A testers very often disable a lot of security things or take some shortcuts so that they can, you know, which they need to do to develop the firmware. But at the end of the day, we got to make sure that those things are turned off, you know, when it finally goes to be deployed, so that, you know, vital services, services that don't need to be running as root are not. Make sure you secure the Wi-Fi. You know, make sure that you're running, you know, WPA 2, or especially, or WPA 3 now that it's out. You know, more and more devices are supporting it. You know, make sure those passwords are very secure. Make sure that, you know, maybe by default, you know, users have access to do guest networks versus their private networks, adding features like that. And then secure the cloud. And what I mean by that is very many more devices are being managed by cloud services, or they have applications on them that are relying on the cloud. And this is something that we've seen a lot. You know, they're connecting to cloud services that might not be secured, or they're passing information that they shouldn't be passing. And then last but not least, you know, that we run into this, and again, you know, Dimitri showed those attack vectors. Don't run unnecessary services. Nobody really needs Telnet anymore to be running on a home gateway. And if nobody, I hate to say that nobody really needs UPnP anymore. And if you look at UPnP as an example, I mean, it is an extremely vulnerable protocol, at least from the implementations. And if you look at like the CSVs on the attack vectors for home gateways, there's something like 80 plus that come from UPnP. So, you know, as part of being aware of your underlying ecosystem, knowing what those services are and shutting down unnecessary services, and making sure that ports that don't need to be opened are not, is basically the best practices that you want to adhere to. And what can you do with them? Work them into your process, work them into your RFPs, you know, make sure that, you know, if you're a service provider, you're making these requirements clear to your vendors. If you are a manufacturer, that you are building these processes into your development specs. Test. Making regular testing part of your process is probably the most important thing. And we break that down in a couple different ways, right? So you want to be able to do active testing. You want to do these things in an automated way, but you want to do active testing where you are examining via various port scanning tools or other hacker tools, how your device appears on the network, right? So you want to run Nmap and see what ports are open. Another feature of software like Nmap is that it fingerprints your device, so it will reveal to you how a device appears, what operating system it's using, you know, what information can be learned if there is an open network connection to it. And then also testing for those things that were 0-day vulnerabilities that people didn't know about, and testing your management protocols and other software APIs for code injection attacks. You know, so code injection being where you're able to use an API call to run low-level commands on a device. That was actually what was behind the Mirai gateway attack, is they were using an open the port that's open for tier 69 connection requests. They were using it to run commands from an old protocol, TR64, but it turned out to just be a code injection attack. It actually didn't have anything to do with TR64 itself. They were passing a command in a parameter, and it worked. So doing that's what we mean by active testing, is you know, doing that sort of it's penetration testing, right? The second thing that we talk about is passive monitoring. So it seems a little weird to do it when you're doing it during testing, but we've actually found a lot of usefulness out of this. So that means passively monitoring the live traffic of your device while it's under test. And you will discover very, very many cool or not so cool things that that your device might be doing when it's trying to connect to all of the services that it's built to connect to. And there's more of those now than there was in the past. And I'll show you how that works in a second when we talk about what we mean by passive monitoring. Obviously validating your security features, right? So you want to test your firewalls, you want to test your your parental controls, you want to test any of the advanced security or privacy features that are actually a feature of your device to make sure that those work. And then you want to do all of this with sort of regular or repeatable automated testing from one firmware to the next. And so when you're doing regression testing and you make sure that a change or a patch hasn't broken anything else, you want to make that part of your regular test cycle. And then we also say we include long-term stability here, even though it's not necessarily something you would think as a security problem. There are devices that, after running for a very long period of time, either they have memory leaks or memory fragmentation or buffer problems where they'll either, they'll lock up, their performance will start to suffer, or at worst, they'll crash and give a would-be attacker access to the underlying device, and we don't want that. So testing that long-term stability and really stressing the device out actually turns out to be a way to something you should include in your security testing. So I do want to point and quickly talk about passive monitoring really quick and why you should do it during testing. What we do in CD Router is we actually separate out the test traffic that CD Router generates. So those things that are being used to stimulate the device and do the basic protocol testing or the basic performance testing, we separate that test traffic out and then send any of the traffic that is not test traffic out to the external network. And as we do that, we monitor it with IDS software, in this particular case, Suricata. And Suricata has thousands of rules already written, but it lets you write your own rules too. And that basically, it's signature based. So it's flagging the traffic. It will create alerts for you whenever it sees something that it knows about. And that gives you kind of a report of how your device is behaving on the live network. And that's extremely useful, right? So if you're evaluating a product that's not necessarily yours, it's very useful, right? Because you can see sort of what's happening or things that you knew or didn't know, or like what websites it's connecting to when it boots up and how it's going about that process or what applications are running on it. But you can also use it to double check your own policy choices, right? So if you know something that it is supposed to be doing, you can write that as a rule. And if it's not doing that, right, you'll be able to see, it'll send you an alert that it's not doing that. I use like TR69 ACS as an example of that, or making sure that it's always connecting to services over HTTPS and not HTTP. There's lots to learn. There's lots to learn from the behavior of devices. there are many things that we've encountered doing it.
I think we have a couple of questions here.
Yeah.
One is like, do you have any examples of how this vulnerabilities could be discovered with the passive monitoring, or that you've seen maybe?
Oh yeah. So again, this is very interesting. Given our audience, it's going to mean different things to different people. But at QA Cafe, obviously, we produce CD Router, the test product for you. But we obviously test a lot of devices in our lab just to test out CD Router and to just know what's out there. And so a lot of times when we've acquired retail devices or things that are these kind of fly-by-night startup projects, that we've built the most secure gateway kind of a thing. It turns out not. And we've seen devices that will connect to cloud services completely unsecured, right? Just over HTTP. We've seen some of those devices pass sensitive data as just part of part of what they're trying to do, right? So there was a parental controls feature that was basically passing all of the MAC addresses of all of the devices in the house to the cloud service, and it was totally unsecured. And so anyone who was able to monitor that traffic could just see the MAC addresses of every single device in your home, or the passwords that you're trying to use to log into the cloud service. Sometimes the cloud services would use bad certs, or they just wouldn't authenticate the users at all, right? Or they would just take whatever they would either pass the passwords in the clear, or take whatever take whatever and just log in anyway. It's kind of a wild world out there, and it comes from the fact that people are demanding this kind of stuff, and everybody's racing to build it. But like you said, Dimitri, security is an afterthought, even if you're building a device for secure purposes.
Unfortunately, yes, that's many times the case.
All right. So ultimately, like we said, this is a conscious choice to do this, and you have to work with your partners at all ends of the supply chain to do this. So work with your vendors, have these open conversations, build the testing and the requirements into your design process and into your business processes, and ultimately everyone will benefit from it. Because what vulnerabilities do is they don't just put your end user at risk; they put your brand at risk, right? So, like, if trying to build secure devices, it's of mutual interest to everyone that you work with to do this stuff. And then also, make sure that you're using technology that helps you maintain these things, right? So, the crazy world that we're in right now, the difference between IoT of consumer electronics of the past and consumer electronics now, like Dimitri said with the refrigerator situation, consumer electronics was used to putting something out with a 1-year warranty, and that's it. They don't have to maintain it anymore. But now these things have to have an upgrade cycle. They have to have the ability to be patched. And for the gateway, at least, that means using management technologies like Tier 69 or USP or things like that to keep the products up to date, and making sure that life cycle exists as part of your process. And then also keeping the applications up to date too, which is nice, as we move towards containerization, which I'm sure Dimitri will talk about in a minute. It makes things a little bit faster so we can update software instead of firmware. Okay. And then, like I said, share results, be open with your partners. For a CD router, at least, it's very easy to import and export. And, if everybody's using the same platform, then it makes it a little bit easier, but be open is the point here. All right. Dimitri, do we have any questions we should jump on right now?
There were a couple of questions related to what are the best practices in developing this kind of a product. I think you covered already quite a lot of those. And people asking if we can recommend special SOCs or MCUs for implementation, for secure implementation. And I wouldn't go into recommending any specific vendors, but as Jason just pointed out, make sure they do have those security analysis done. They do source code reviews. They do. And they can actually provide some sort of a proof to you about that, saying that, okay, this is how secure product is. This is how kind of a security standards that we follow. This is how often we do them. This is how we do them after you actually buy the product and things like that. So that's where I would pay attention to. And also, do these manufacturers work with external companies that are building themselves, that are building these products? Because it's a different thing looking at your own source code and looking at your own product. It's always going to look nice because it's your own, right? But then let somebody else take a look at it as well. Let them do a review. Let them do like an automated test, or even like some sort of a deep dive into finding maybe new vulnerabilities or doing source code reviews and things like that. So that's where I would put more attention to.
Yeah, for sure. What is the number one attack that gets past the home router that's not phishing?
That's a tough one.
I would say weak, default credentials on devices.
Definitely, I would have said some sort of a Mirai variant, because that's a majority of today's like botnet attacks is based on some sort of a Mirai attack, and they're usually using some sort of a password to get into, or a password list to get into SSH or telnet port. There's a question about 5G. I will actually just jump into that, like how to protect in 5G. So
okay. All right. Why don't we continue then?
All right. So, you know, when we think about protecting the customers kind of from these different attacks in F-Secure side, and I'm talking purely from the consumer point of view, because that's what I do, and that's where we kind of operate with our operator partners. We look at it from 3 different angles. You know, we call it 3-layer security strategy, and this is kind of what we recommend for majority of our ISP partners. And one of the angles is the cloud, so you can protect from the cloud, and you can protect either the service itself in the cloud, or you can protect the user's kind of traffic in the cloud. And this is where the kind of 5G networks and 4G networks comes into play, that you can deploy some sort of a network-based security. Gateway itself is a very good protection point, and then obviously the endpoint. You know, let's not forget about the endpoint. The closer you get to the customer, the better protection you can typically provide, because you can see more information, you can access more data, you have access to the operating systems, and then that provides you a better visibility, and that way you can protect the customer better. So this kind of a strategy provides you the peace of mind basically wherever the customer goes, whether they are on your network, on your competitor's network, on the Starbucks Wi-Fi. You know, that kind of works throughout the cycle. And then if we look specifically in these different areas, gateway is actually the most optimal location for the security. And let me explain why. It provides, like, cloud protections are good. They provide instant, like we call this like a thin blanket protection for everybody. And then it's usually the same level, same settings and things like that. And it doesn't require like much of an update for the end user. It doesn't require actions from end user. It becomes very problematic when we get a layer down, so to say, and we start actually looking at what can we filter with the cloud-based or network-based solution. Many of them don't scan, for example, encrypted traffic, which today is majority of the traffic already. And then if we look at the gateway, it actually is kind of in between the network-based protection and the endpoint. And the gateway is kind of, it has the visibility to the devices. It scales because, you know, the devices that we're delivering today as a gateways, they're actually quite robust. They have, like, some of them quad-core CPUs and whatnot in them, so that they can process quite a lot of information. You don't need to send everything to the cloud because it's expensive, right? But there's also a downside for the gateway security, that it cannot protect when the customer is not connected to that gateway. So that's why we kind of always recommend to have the endpoint part covered as well, with the traditional endpoint security for the end user's smarter devices, so to say. And when we talk about smarter devices, we talk about laptops and phones and things like that. So either like a VPN-based solution or an actual AV solution that runs on the device. Usually, the closer you get to the customer, also, you know, the better monetization opportunity that provides. And it's, you know, it's not a topic of this webinar, but just to kind of mention that when customers see something and they realize better that they are protected, when you're protecting them somewhere very far away from them, then they never understand that protection actually happens. You know, a lot of ISPs are doing very well protecting their networks, but none of the customers know about it because it's not their job, like, to understand that. But when you have something in customer's face, whether it's, you know, your app that you control your gateway with, or it's your endpoint security solution, it's there, and you can communicate to the customer what is going on. And then, you know, Jason mentioned quite a lot of these different protection levels, and I would add one more into that. You know, now with the containers entering the CPE space, and a lot of vendors are already supporting them, and many are designing the support for them. We see that that's definitely the future, and there's 2 reasons. First of all, it's the lifecycle management. You know, you have to be able to upgrade that fridge at some point, because it will be just, you know, old and vulnerable and so forth. And this containerization provides an easy delivery mechanism using the, you know, TR69 or USB or any other remote management capabilities that you have. It could be even through an SSH, for example. Don't use Telnet, you know, SSH is fine, better. And
even then.
Exactly. The containers basically provide you this additional level of security when you're deploying solutions on the gateways. And this is where we see the world going. There will be more and more services deployed on the local gateways. You know, it starts now with the device detection and security and parental controls. But, you know, give it 5-10 years, you will be streaming some sort of a Netflix app from your gateway that will it will be a cache location or something like that for, I don't know, Netflix CDN type of a solution or something like that. So there will be more and more apps, so to say, on the gateways, and you need to isolate them somehow. In the same way as Apple has protected their app store very, very well, you know, this is exactly what needs to happen with the CPEs and the containers, so you can access, you know, you can control what they're accessing, like the permissions, the access levels, the ability to access the network traffic, the customer's private information, and things like that. And we do a couple of those things. So now, you know, how can we protect against those threats, basically, that I mentioned in the beginning? And I'm going to give you 2 examples. One is kind of on the user level, so protecting the customer from those phishing attacks and user-initiated threats in general. We do something called browsing protection. So this is something that you can embed on your CPE, and it will basically filter everywhere the customer goes, and not only the customer itself, but also the devices on the network. So if they're trying to access like a malicious location somewhere outside on the network, what will happen is that we will intercept that traffic, say it's malicious, it's unsafe, and then basically block it, and then tell the user that, hey, you know, you should really not go here, or, you know, you should disconnect that device that is going there. And then when we look at the device level, a lot of activities are happening on the network without kind of the user knowing it. Like cameras is a good example. There's been a lot of attacks against cameras so that they become part of the botnet. And, you know, it might still function normally, but you wouldn't know that there's something else going on the other side. And it might be, I don't know, mining Bitcoin or sending your feed somewhere in a public site or whatever else. So what we're doing is we're looking into these different patterns that come from the devices. So we learned the unique pattern that this is what the device should be doing normally on the home network. So it connects, let's say you have a smart TV. It connects to the manufacturer's website 4 times a day to check for the latest updates. That's totally normal. But if it starts to connect to some, you know, weird location 25,000 times a day, not exactly normal behavior for a smart TV, unless it's a Netflix and you're an extreme streamer. So we will basically highlight that to the user and block that kind of a traffic and send the alert to the customer. So this is just a couple of examples how to protect the actual user and the devices within the network, in addition to those that, you know, Jason explained on how to protect the CPE itself from various types of from attacks from outside networks towards the home network. And I think that was the end of this part. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we do have a few more.
Okay.
There is one that I'll take, but it sounds so much like a seed question that I don't. I promise it's not.
There was one related to the 5G networks.
Yeah.
I kind of covered that already. We do see that 5G will, you know, the home routers will actually become more and more 5G enabled, that you will have like fixed wireless access type of 5G routers. And then you have to kind of secure that in the home network, but then also on the actual 5G networks that you're provided by the mobile operators. There are some deployments ongoing that you can protect and provide these kind of a protection services on the 5G network itself. So filtering for the phishing emails or filtering for malicious IoT traffic and things like that can be done on a network level. And that's probably one of those places where that needs to be deployed.
Yeah, and also, it's ultimately, if we're talking about, they were talking about the UEs, and if you don't, you either have control or you don't. And if we always have to just think about what you have control over. You have control over monitoring those devices while they're in the home. So if they end up getting compromised and have some application running that's like Dimitri was talking about, that detects for those things, then you'll be able to do that after the fact. But when it comes to the gateway, if 4G or 5G connection on it, you get protected just like you would protect anything else.
At that point, actually, the endpoint protection becomes quite important, because then it doesn't matter what network you're connected to. If you're using a VPN, or if you're using an endpoint security on your laptop, it doesn't matter what the connection mechanism is, really.
Okay, so this is a question, kind of a CD router specific question. So the question is, do we use any services to keep up with current vulnerabilities? The answer to that question is twofold. So there's things that we do at QA Cafe when building CD router for testing the gateway from a security perspective. And the first is the passive monitoring that I was talking about. And that uses the SECUR rule set. The SECUR rule set is updated by us every time we update CD router, which is about once a month. So anything that's become an official part of the rule set gets added to CD router. The second way that those things can be updated is you can build your own custom rules, or you can import them. So there's other rule sets that are out there that target specific things, or they're based on new information, but they're custom. They were just built by somebody else. You can import those, or you can build your own rules if you know of a particular vulnerability or something that you want to watch out for and make sure a device is doing or not doing. You can add those to the SECUR rule set, and then that will be that will be flagged by the passive monitoring. The other part of that question is keeping up to date with current CVEs. There are only so many that come out for gateways, but even still, developing test cases for those is generally it does take some effort. And so we try to be very specific and do those on a case-by-case basis. So when we're alerted to something, we'll see if it actually makes a valuable test or not, and then work that into CD router.
There's a question related to the small-scale IoT network, where there's no specific concern paid to the security. What is the least required sufficient security implementation that we would recommend? This is again one of those things, like when somebody asks, like, what is the least amount that we can do? It's not necessarily the good starting point, but I would say that definitely let run the basics, like the basic vulnerability scans, at least, just to kind of get rid of those obvious mistakes, that there's no open ports, that there's no known vulnerabilities. Jason was talking about the CVEs, and just check kind of against those. But again, I would still get a third-party view on that.
Yes,
that's the best assurance for yourself that you have done the least possible, basically.
Right. That's something maybe we didn't touch too much on, is that you don't necessarily have to be it's not your job to be the experts on this, right? There are people out there that know, that know how to do this and how to do, threat assessments and attack, analyzing attack vectors and all those things. It's literally their job. So, and actually along those lines, I'm glad you did bring that up, though. Ultimately, we're always talking about the basics. Like, if you cover the basics, you're going to be protected by a lot of things. So even CD router keeping up to date on current CVEs, there are a number of test cases that we've built over the years that literally do cover the baseline things that are most attacks are based off of, right? So just as something as simple as accepting bad certificates when connecting your GUI, right? That's something very basic, something that you can cover with automated testing. that isn't, it's not going to be something that's out of the blue. It's something that an attacker will exploit. It was probably just something that was missed. And it's, it's not something that is a surprise. Well, it doesn't have to be a surprise.
And it also depends on your industry, right? It depends what are you making, like what is the device, what is the IoT network that you're trying to protect. If you're working in, I'd say, if you're working in a hospital, you have an IoT network to protect there. I would run rather robust set of tests. But if it's some sort of a small network which doesn't have necessarily kind of too much of a personal information or too much of a or any personal information for that matter, that the security can be limited in that sense scenario. So it's also comparative to what are you trying to protect, basically. And then if it's just your own data that you're trying to protect, it's a different thing when compared to when you're deploying something to the mass market and you're responsible for everybody else's data as well. So then the expectation and the protection mechanism and the tools that you're using should be lifted.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a question about that I had mentioned UPnP, and it wasn't that it was 80% of the CVE listings, but there were at least 80 CVE listings if you go and you look for UPnP. So how do you deal with devices that are using it, like gaming consoles? For those who don't know too much about UPnP, it was mostly pushed by Microsoft and then became kind of a standardized thing. So naturally, you expect Microsoft products make use of it. So how do you deal with consumer devices that need to use UPnP if you plan on turning it off? I would say the best thing you can do is to do that. Either test for those CVEs, but also just do general active testing. The code injection stuff is a big deal when it comes to that, right? So either there's two things that can go wrong with UPnP. The first is that they're able to do stuff to the device through UPnP because of stolen credentials or bad credentials, right? And that's a problem because then if it's using UPnP DM, then you can do all sorts of things that you could do like with TR69, you can do those things to the device, like open ports and that kind of thing. And right, that's literally what it's used for things like Xbox is to open certain ports. I don't know how common that is anymore, or how much it's relying on other systems now, but that is how they use that. The other thing would be code injection, right? So if you're using UPnP, your UPnP DM, make some effort to test the fact that if you put cruft or bad information or commands into escape characters and that kind of thing into a UPnP parameter, that it's not going to execute on the device. And then make sure there's nothing else, in general, make sure that there aren't other services that don't need to be running, right? So if there's, if there's one attack surface that's very common, like UPnP, and you happen to have some other system that is like Samba or file sharing that can then be exploited by somebody who's got in via UPnP, then that's a problem. So the more you control the rest of things, the more secure the end user will be. All right. Well, that's an hour. Those are some great questions, people. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dimitri, for joining me today. I've been looking forward to this for a while. It's been something that we've needed to talk about for a while. So I think this was the right pairing.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. And let's do this again sometime.
Yeah. So yeah, if you want more info about F-Secure Sense, there's a link there. We do have a security ebook that QA Cafe just put out that you can find on our website. And if we will be making a video of this available and with the slide deck, we'll send that out to the people who registered so that you can view it at your leisure. I know we had a couple of people write in saying, "Oh no, I can't make it." So don't worry, you'll definitely get access to that. And I look forward to some more stuff in the future. Dimitri and I talked about a couple things that we maybe do in Q1 next year to kind of expand on these topics. So look forward to that.
Definitely.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And I look forward to talking to you all soon. And yeah, have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.